Good afternoon. Welcome to the Nauman Smith webinar, in 30 minutes, restrictions on transient housing in residential zones. My name is Steve Feinauer. I am a partner at the firm and the head of the Municipal Law Practice Group. With me is my partner, Josh Bond, who also does a lot of municipal work within our practice group. Before we get started, there are a couple of housekeeping items to cover. As announced, our webinar today is being recorded. Only our presenters' videos will be captured, however. You're welcome to turn your videos on so that we can see your faces and reactions to today's content, but that is your personal choice. We do ask that everyone remain on mute during the presentation. We welcome questions and feedback on today's session. We will allow time at the end of the presentation to open the floor for questions. At that time, you can unmute yourself and present your question. If you would like to enter a question in the chat feature, go ahead and do so, and Josh and I will attempt to answer it. Finally, you will receive a link to today's recording along with contact information for both Josh and I by the end of the week. So with that, if everybody's ready, we'll start on the presentation. As announced, the topic is restrictions on transient housing in residential districts. Whenever I think of the word transient, I tend to think more of like vagrants and hobos and things of that sort. But in recent years, that term has taken on new meaning, particularly within the context of municipal zoning and regulations. Most frequently, those issues arise in the low density or R1 residential districts. That's not to say that they can't also arise in other districts, medium density or otherwise. But typically, ordinances for the low density residential districts limited the uses within those districts to single family dwellings. And that would be the traditional detached or semi-detached house with individuals living in them. The recent trends in housing and shared dwellings has really put pressure on the traditional municipal ordinances. Now, I'm sure everybody's aware, zoning ordinances are adopted by the municipalities pursuant to their police power to promote and protect the health, safety, and welfare of their community. Now that power is sometimes in tension with the constitutional right of property owners to enjoy and engage or use their property in the manners that they wish. So within that context, municipalities typically have zoning districts where they control what types of uses and activities occur in the particular districts. Obviously, the residential zoning districts are the most restrictive and are intended to protect basically the lives and health and safety of the residents in those districts. With the advent of the online residential rentals, the Airbnb, HomeAway, luxury stay, Verbo, there's been increased use of private single-family residences as housing or temporary housing for people who are either vacationing or traveling to a location for a particular temporary event, such as a wedding, a conference, things of that sort. So, and I'm sure for those of you who are zoning officers, you're probably running into complaints about these activities almost on a daily basis. Now, depending on the nature of the community and its location, these may be greater frequency or lesser. Areas such as that are popular vacation destinations, such as the Poconos, the Gettysburg area, Philadelphia, Harrisburg, any place where there is a tourist destination, they are particularly prone to have the transitory or transient housing issues. For that reason, it should come as no surprise that a lot of the earlier cases came out of the Poconos region, where people own private homes, many of them purchased for investment purposes, and because it's a very popular vacation destination, they were offered for rental to travelers that are going there. The seminal case that came out of the Poconos was called Slice of Life LLC versus Hamilton Township Zoning Hearing Board. It's a 2019 Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision where an individual, actually were individuals, purchased a property solely as an investment property and for short-term rental purposes. They formed a Pennsylvania LLC to own the property, and then proceeded to heavily advertise this property as a location for temporary housing for vacation stays. Now, it wasn't too long before those users, if you will, drew complaints from other residents in the community in Hamilton Township. Josh will later in the program talk about the negative aspects of the transient housing and the problems that can sometimes accompany those types of uses. In this case, this was no exception. There were larger groups, sometimes college groups, younger people, a lot of parties. There were other issues with parking, noise, etc., all of which led to complaints to the zoning officer about the use of that property. Hamilton Township had a zoning ordinance that restricted detached dwellings to use by families. And the question was, did that definition in the township ordinance exclude transient uses, including short-term rentals? Now, cases up to that point had largely held that in order to exclude a short-term rental use or transient use, it had to be specifically excluded in the zoning ordinance. Slice of Life changed the landscape on that. In that case, the township had what was typically a fairly common and well-accepted definition of family, and the Supreme Court went on to hold that restricting use of dwellings to families excludes, includes transient uses, excludes transient uses, and that the township did not need to specifically exclude them in express language. Now, that's important for municipalities because these remote and transient stays and platforms are changing almost daily. I mean, there are, every day I see a new one, and they're all over the board in terms of modest residential living. There are also those that are dealing with luxury stays and like Edge Retreat and catering to the more affluent people. So first instance, for a zoning officer or solicitor or municipal official, you need to closely check your definition of family. Many cases, family was traditionally thought of as a single housekeeping unit. But then the question is, with some home sharing arrangements, what is a single housekeeping unit? So the important thing to remember is that with housing in residential zones, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution that works for every municipality. Historically, in defining single housekeeping units, the courts adopted a definition that required occupants of a home to live and behave in a manner like that of a family. Now, it wasn't necessarily requiring a biological relationship, but certainly that went to it. So there were definitions that were looking to that part. In the slice of life case, the court specifically stated the permanence and stability of people living in a single family residential zoning district creates a sense of community, cultivates and fosters relationships, provides overall quality of a place where people are invested and engaged in their neighborhood and care about each other. This can be a place where children can play together, neighbors can know each other and look out for one another and enjoy the quiet seclusion of their homes. Examples of municipal ordinances, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania has a good short-term rental ordinance. Also the municipalities in Monroe County, the home of the Poconos, as well as the county itself, have model ordinances. So looking back at the slice of life case, it demonstrates that the specific language of the municipal ordinance is very much important. And with that, I'll turn over the mic to Josh and let him talk about some of the problems with transient housing.
Thanks, Steve. Yes, this slide lists some of the problems that arise from short-term rentals and transient use of residential housing. One of the impacts that's sort of yet to be seen is the long-term, the impact on long-term rentals and whether that's going to inflate rental costs. And I see that as a something that's going to be different from municipality to municipality. Some municipalities may have an issue that there's not enough rental housing. Other municipalities may have the opposite problem. So whenever you're looking at an ordinance, that's one of the things that you want to look at is what is the rental market in your area and what type of impact is this proliferation of short-term rentals having on your municipality. I think some of the negative impacts are pretty obvious. You don't want these rentals to turn into party houses where you're going to have large, rowdy, noisy parties, sex work, drugs, that type of thing. Municipalities would want to avoid residential neighborhoods being used for those purposes. There's also a concern that short-term rentals create an unfair playing field for hotels and motels, and also that as a result, municipalities can lose tax revenues. And but as I'll go on to the next slide, there are things that municipalities can do to try to counteract these negative outcomes of short-term rentals. First thing that I would recommend is that municipalities distinguish between the various types of short-term rental uses. one thing that you can look at as an example of this is Gettysburg Borough's ordinance, which distinguishes between owner-occupied properties where maybe 1 or 2 rooms are rented out versus a property that's totally an investment property. It's not owner-occupied and it's just rented year-round. The Gettysburg ordinance has 2 definitions to distinguish that. The former is defined as a homestay. The latter is defined as a vacation rental. The definition of a homestay is a dwelling unit wherein a maximum of 2 rooms are available for use or are used for short-term lodging, and where such lodging is provided for compensation, and where the dwelling unit is concurrently occupied as a permanent residence by the operator. The other type of rental, defined as a vacation rental, is defined as a dwelling unit that is available for use or is used for short-term lodging, and where such lodging is provided for compensation, and where the dwelling unit is not concurrently occupied by the operator of the use. By distinguishing between the types of short-term rentals, you can more tailor the impact on your community. You can allow homestays in some zoning districts, but outlaw vacation rentals in those same districts. Another thing that municipalities can do is they can have further oversight of short-term rentals by making these types of uses subject to either special exception approval before the zoning hearing board or conditional use approval. And you can outline those types of conditions within your zoning ordinance. Some municipalities, to try to counter the loss of tax revenue or the loss of control, have licensing and inspection ordinances. One example you could use of this is Easton City. Easton City has an ordinance that requires owners of non-owner occupied dwelling units to apply for a business license annually and to complete a rental registration form. The owner is required to maintain a list of the occupants, including people over the age of 18, their name, address, and telephone number, and they're required to furnish that list to the city annually when they're renewing their license and registration request. That's, if you want to look at that, Google that. It's section 456-18 of the Easton City zoning ordinance. Another method that you can use to try to have some oversight of these short-term rentals is to set occupancy limits. Okay, I see a question coming through. I'll get to that in a minute here. Mount Pocono Borough is an example of an ordinance that sets a occupancy limit, and the way that they do it is that they have a table that limits the number of occupants based on the number of bedrooms that are available for rent. The Mount Pocono ordinance also limits the number of vehicles that can be at a vacation rental or a short-term rental overnight, and you are required to get approval to have a short-term rental in that municipality. One of the conditions is that you need to have certain parking spaces available per the number of bedrooms. That ordinance of Mount Pocono Borough also makes the owner responsible to limit disturbances by renters. Going back to Gettysburg's ordinance, there is a provision of that ordinance that requires the owner to make available someone 24/7 who is within a certain geographical limit of the borough to be available to answer complaints that are lodged with the borough regarding the short-term lodging. And one last thing that I would recommend, and that I've been researching these various ordinances, is I would really recommend that you, if you do enact an ordinance, that you have forms that not only gather information from the owners of these properties, but that the forms summarize the requirements of your ordinance. A lot of times it's hard for a property owner to go through a zoning ordinance and find all the different sections that are applicable that they have to comply with. If you have that all on a licensing or registration form, if you have those requirements listed there, that's a form that the owner signs whenever they get their license or permit. And then that way they don't have to scour your zoning ordinance, and two, it's all in one place and they can't act like they didn't know what those regulations were. So either putting that on the form that they use to apply for a license, or having a fact sheet available on your website is really useful. The question is, do you have an opinion on the best way to determine occupancy limits? We were thinking sewage when there's an on-lot sewage system, but others feel it's based on square footage of a room or rooms. Our area has no public sewage for any of the 60+ short-term rentals. Others that adopted short-term rentals have used 3 bedrooms for on-lot sewage systems, but there are other options to determine the maximum amount of occupancy other than sewage permitting. Well, I would answer that question and again direct you towards the Mount Pocono Borough Ordinance, because that bases the occupancy limits based on the number of bedrooms that are available for rent. And I believe it is, if you have 2 bedrooms, you can have up to 6 renters stay overnight. And then there's a graduated list. If you have 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, that number increases. I think you also need to consider with that the number of cars that are going to be used by people who are renting. So if you have, if you're allowing 6 people to stay at a residence, you probably want to limit the number of vehicles to 2 or possibly to 1. And you also want to consider what parking's available. That's even something that you could set up a condition that it's determined on a case-by-case basis. I mean, the parking may be different. Someone who has a house that they're renting out in the middle of the country may have unlimited parking, but if you're looking at a more populated area, there may be really limited parking options available, and you may want to limit the number of guests because of the impact that's going to have on parking. So I hope that answers your question. I am going to actually open it up now to have a question and answer session. So if someone wants to unmute themselves, we are really interested in hearing what type of issues you're encountering in your municipality, and if we can have any ability to answer questions on that. So at this time, I'd invite you to, if anyone wants to ask any questions verbally, now's the time for that.
Josh, I can offer just one personal experience, and that I live in the heart of Camp Hill Borough, and I've been hearing from neighbors that Airbnbs or transient rentals are everywhere. And ironically, there's one across the street, 3 doors down from me, that there were weeks before I knew it was being used as an Airbnb. And it was only because the cars that would appear there periodically had license plates from different states. Now, that one is an owner-occupied double house, which is fairly conducive to that type of arrangement. Technically, it's not permitted by the zoning ordinance, but so far, everybody's been well behaved. The people I've seen coming in have been coming for college graduations, weddings, events up at the farm show building. And I guess it's yet to be determined what's going to happen. And the biggest thing and why it's key that there be a registration and inspection requirement is it's really difficult for zoning officers to keep an eye on and enforce these regulations because there are so many. The properties look just like any other, private residence, and yet the municipality does have an interest in trying to keep tabs on them and control what they're used for and how many of them there are.
Another resource you may want to look at is Lancaster City right now either is in the process of adopting a short-term rental ordinance or it has adopted a short-term rental ordinance. I'm not sure what the current status of that is, but that is another municipality that's either taken action or going to take action very, very shortly. There's definitely a draft ordinance out there. I'm just not sure if it's been finally approved yet by city council.
There is a website that I came across when I was researching the subject. It's called the STR, Short-Term Rental Scorecard, Municipal Rules on Short-Term Rentals in Carbon County and the Poconos. Now, if you Google short-term rentals, Poconos, this should come up. It's published by an entity named PoconoVacationHomeSales.com, but they basically survey and analyze the zoning rules and regulations regarding short-term rentals throughout the county and municipality by municipality. And it's interesting because they vary quite a bit. Now, when you get to the areas close to the ski resorts and other popular places in the Poconos, obviously the registration inspection requirements are more stringent. But if you're looking for some guidance, that's an interesting link because you can link to all the various municipalities and whether they have a permit requirement ordinance or not. And it's just helpful.
Oh, and one additional point that I had is that a lot of these municipalities that are having property registration requirements for short-term rentals, they actually have an overall renter property registration, and they just make that part of the overall renter registration. Although I know that those ordinances have come under some scrutiny, and I don't believe a lot of mid-state municipalities have adopted rental registration ordinances for short-term rentals. But that's how the municipalities in the Poconos and in the eastern part of the state are dealing. One of the tools they're using to deal with short-term rentals. So I think that closes up the webinar. If anyone does have any additional questions, we're willing to stay on longer for that. But if anything comes up afterwards, Steve and I do represent a number of municipalities here in the mid-state. And if anyone has any questions or anything, please feel free to reach out to us, and we can try to offer some more education to tailor solutions based on your specific circumstances and needs of each municipality.
Excuse me, may I just ask if you are aware of current court cases in which in R1 areas, HOAs are being sued because they have restricted short-term rentals based on their covenants, which say no business, no hotels?
I am aware there was an article in the Pennsylvania Lawyer about that, and there's been a concern that HOAs are not. Well, the concern I think is that the residential one zoning designation is becoming a thing of the past and may go away. And some HOAs, in order to prevent the loss of the R1 zoning designation, have been adopting restrictions on that. I'm not aware of any appellate case law that's definitively decided that issue, but I do believe that those cases are going to be working their way through the courts, where HOAs put restrictions on short-term rentals, and whether or not those HOAs restrictions are valid. I think that's going to be an area of litigation in the near future.
Thank you.
Okay, well, not seeing any additional questions. I'd just like to thank everyone for participating today. And please follow up if you have any additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.